Hey everyone, this is Dr. Marcon, and this is a video going over the histology slides that I either posted on Canvas or have emailed to you. So first we're going to go over the slides for connective tissue proper and the integumentary system. So connective tissue proper is made up of loose connective tissue as well as dense connective tissue, and we're going to look at the slides first at loose connective tissue, then dense connective tissue. So here's our typical slide of loose areolar connective tissue. We can see the different fibers that are making up the loose areolar connective tissue. Again, this is the model tissue because it has all elements within the extracellular matrix. You have all three protein fibers as well as ground substance that make up the extracellular matrix, as well as you can see the nuclei of your fibroblasts. So again, typical loose areolar connective tissue. These thin fibers here are the elastic fibers, and then the thicker pink staining fibers, those are your collagen fibers. However, you will not be able to see the reticular fibers as they have not stained in these slides. So again, just another slide of loose areolar connective tissue with the thin, wiry, elastic fibers, and then the thicker pink collagen fibers, and then the nuclei of the fibroblasts. And another slide of loose areolar connective tissue. Also under loose connective tissue, we have our adipose tissue made up of adipose cells. So this slide is a good representation of the cells that make up adipose tissue, which is our adipocytes. We can see the nuclei being pushed to the periphery of the cell, and that fat droplet taking up the large portion of the middle of the cell. Also on this slide you can actually see some representative skeletal muscle here, and you might see some very thin-walled blood vessels. But for this slide I'm going to focus mostly on the adipose tissue. So this slide, or the next couple slides, are going to be the third type of your loose connective tissue. We have the reticular tissue, reticular connective tissue. So we will find this, of course, in our spleen and lymph nodes and lymph organs. You can see the reticular fibers here within the tissue. So this helps you identify this as reticular connective tissue. You'll see this again in this slide, these darker lines that kind of look like tree branches. This will help you identify this as reticular connective tissue. And again, dark lines looking like sort of like those bonsai trees that you can see growing. Again, reticular connective tissue. Then we get into our dense connective tissue. The first dense connective tissue we're going to see is dense irregular connective tissue. Again, it's a kind of whirly pattern within the dense irregular connective tissue, and we know that dense irregular connective tissue kind of helps with tensile tension within many directions. So this is an example of dense irregular connective tissue. We'll also see dense irregular connective tissue in the dermis, within the reticular layer of the dermis. And here is dense regular connective tissue. We'll see those wavy, parallel collagen fibers within the dense regular connective tissue, again helping with tension in one direction. So this is an example of dense regular connective tissue. Again, more dense regular connective tissue. So make sure you're able to identify this and differentiate this from smooth muscle tissue. So here we can see some adipose tissue, and then we see some dense irregular connective tissue. This slide also shows a vein here. We can see a vein with its very thin layers compared to arteries, which we'll see in the next slide. but we can definitely see our dense connective tissue represented in the slide, specifically dense irregular connective tissue. So this next slide showing elastic connective tissue, specifically within the walls of major blood vessels. This is an artery, and we can see these dark fibers, which are the elastic fibers here, elastic connective tissue represented in this slide. Again, more of these beautiful elastic fibers or elastin fibers that make up the elastic connective tissue within, this is specifically the tunica media of a major blood vessel, specifically probably an artery. And more of that elastic connective tissue or elastic fibers. This slide shows you the differences between an artery and a vein. So again, a vein has a thinner layer of cells within its walls, whereas within the artery we see that thick muscular tunica media, and it's a lot thicker compared to the tunica media of a vein. So this structure below the pointer would be an artery, whereas this structure here above the pointer would be a vein. So next couple slides are going to talk about the integumentary system. Make sure you guys are comfortable identifying the different layers of the epidermis from superficial to deep. Also identifying the different layers of the dermis, with the papillary layer being above the thicker reticular layer. We know that loose areolar tissue can be found in the papillary layer, whereas we have a dense irregular connective tissue within the reticular layer of the dermis. Also in the integumentary system, you want to look at the different appendages, the hair follicles, parts of the hair follicles, the hair root, the hair shaft, the bulb, and then other structures in the dermis, including some of the appendages like the sebaceous gland, sweat glands, and the erector pili muscle. So in this slide, it's a very busy slide, but we can see that this has the epithelium of thinner skin. So this is still a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium with the different layers. The only difference between this epithelium and the epithelium of thick skin, such as the palms of the hands and soles of the feet, is that it does not have that stratum lucidum above the stratum granulosum, but all other layers within the epidermis are still represented. So here is the epidermis, and then below it is the dermis. We have that first layer of the dermis made up of loose areolar connective tissue, and we can see these are the dermal papilla, so this is the papillary layer. And then below the papillary layer, making up about 80% of the dermis, is the reticular layer. And within the reticular layer, we can see the dense irregular connective tissue. Now this slide is a really good slide because you can see part of the hair root here, and then the hair shaft is the part of the hair follicle that can be seen that goes above the epidermis. Here we can see also the different glands contained within the dermis. So these structures here, these are the sebaceous glands. They secrete sebum, which helps kind of lubricate the hair follicle and the hair shaft. And then these structures here that sort of have a almost simple cuboidal epithelium, these are the sweat glands. Okay, so the kind of lighter shade cells here, this is sebaceous glands. These are also sebaceous glands here, groups of sebaceous glands. And then this structure here, made up of smooth muscle, this is part of the erector pili muscle. Again, that allows for the hair follicle kind of stand on end. Okay, so a lot of things you can identify on this slide, the different layers of the dermis, the type of epithelium. You have your sebaceous glands, your sweat glands, and then we have the erector pili muscle, and then of course part of the hair follicle with the hair root being below the surface of the skin, and then the hair shaft going above the epidermis. So let's get rid of that. All right, moving on to the next slide. Again, we know that this is thin skin. We have the epithelium, the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium within the epidermis, and then the different layers of the dermis. We have the papillary layer of the dermis, and then the reticular layer, each having different types of connective tissue. Again, these kind of opaque type cells, these make up the sebaceous glands. And then we have sort of a simple cuboidal type groups of cells. These are your sweat glands. And then you can see part of the hair follicle with the hair root, and then just a little bit of the hair shaft. So here is the hair bulb, which is the lower portion of the root. So here's that dermal papillae that makes up the hair bulb, and then you have the medulla as well as the cortex of the hair bulb. With regards to connective tissue, we can see some adipose tissue and of course some dense irregular connective tissue. Another histo slide. Here we can actually see some really good glands. We can see these opaque cells that make up the sebaceous glands. And then here, with that simple cuboidal epithelium, we can see the sweat glands. Okay. And we have the different layers of the dermis with the papillary layer and the reticular layer, with the different types of connective tissue, loose areolar in the papillary and dense irregular in the reticular. Here's a close-up of the sweat glands in the dermis. So these structures here are the sweat glands, and we can see a few of the sebaceous glands here. And if this is smooth muscle, this would be probably part of the erector pili muscle. And then we can see the hair root here. This whole structure is the hair root. So this looks to be thick skin, because we can see sloughing off of the corneal layer, and it's a little bit thicker compared to the stratum corneum of thin skin. So this would be thick skin. Again, we have our epidermis, and we can see the different layers of the epidermis represented here. Here's that clear layer above the stratum granulosum, which is the stratum lucidum, only found in thick skin. And then we have our epidermis, and then we have the papillary layer of the dermis made up of loose areolar connective tissue, and then the dense irregular connective tissue of the reticular layer of the dermis. And this is just more thick skin. Here we can actually see some adipose tissue. We might see some sweat glands here. We see our dense irregular connective tissue, loose areolar connective tissue, and then just the deeper parts of the layers of the epithelium. Here's a model of skin and the hair follicle. So we have the hair root, which is below the skin surface, and we see the hair bulb here, and that that little dermal papillae. Here is the smooth muscle that makes up the erector pili muscle. We have our sebaceous glands that will empty into the hair follicle, and then here we have our sweat glands, again, which is a type of exocrine gland. We know it has a duct that will secrete its contents onto the surface of the skin. And we have our little adipocytes making up our adipose tissue. Again, we have our different glands that we can see within the skin model. Sebaceous glands, we might have some sweat glands, and here is that erector pili muscle, all contained within the dermis. And you'll see the papillary layer, and then we have the the reticular layer, and then below the dermis is the hypodermis, where you will have adipose tissue. Okay, and just another picture of the integumentary system with the different layers and different structures and appendages. And that's it for connective tissue proper, as well as integumentary system. Let me go over the slides for cartilage, muscle, and bone. So here's the PowerPoint on muscle, cartilage, and bone histo slides. This is one of the PowerPoints that I emailed everyone because it would not let me upload it onto Canvas. So first we'll talk about muscle tissue. We have the three types. We have skeletal muscle, we have cardiac muscle with the intercalated discs, and then smooth muscle. So here's a longitudinal section of skeletal muscle. Again, we'll see those striations within the muscle fiber. The dark bands making up the A bands and the light bands making up the I bands. We have, it's a multinucleate cell, so there's many nuclei within the periphery of the skeletal muscle. And just more lovely striations of skeletal muscle. Another example of skeletal muscle, and here you can actually see the dark and the light bands up close, as well as the nuclei of the muscle fiber. And more skeletal muscle. And more skeletal muscle. This is not skeletal muscle. This is actually cardiac muscle, because we can see these dark lines that allow for the cardiac muscle fibers to interdigitate, and we can see that there is a branching pattern within the cardiac muscle as opposed to the long parallel rows of the longitudinal muscle fibers. So we have branching within the cardiac muscle fibers. We have these darker bands, which is the intercalated discs, and then we can see the nuclei of the cardiac muscle. And here is a better picture of the intercalated discs, which are these dark bands, and then we still see striations within cardiac muscle, and we can see the branching between the fibers. And more cardiac muscle fiber. Here we see different sections of smooth muscle. So here we have our smooth muscle cells. There are no striations compared to skeletal and cardiac muscle. So this is a nice longitudinal section of smooth muscle. And here we have a transverse or cross section of smooth muscle. Again, just more smooth muscle here, and then cross section of smooth muscle below it. So this is the third type of muscle, which is smooth muscle, lining the hollow organs of the body, such as the uterus, the stomach, the esophagus. Next, we'll talk about cartilage really quick. So we have three types of cartilage. We have the hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage. So make sure you guys are comfortable being to identify the different types of cartilage as well as their location. Here we have hyaline cartilage. This is hyaline cartilage. We can see the mature osteocytes sitting in those spaces called lacunae, lacunae matata. So this is an example of hyaline cartilage. We can find hyaline cartilage in different places, such as the cartilage of the nose, the costal cartilages of the ribs, and at the end of long bones. Here's just a sort of a close-up of hyaline cartilage. We can see these sort of clusters and kind of looks like a ground glass appearance. So we can see the mature osteocytes sitting in the spaces called the lacuna. And just more hyaline cartilage with these clusters of osteocytes within their lacuna. More hyaline cartilage there. This is fibrocartilage. I know this is fibrocartilage because instead of clusters, we have our chondrocytes in rows. And here we can see more kind of stacks of rows on the side. So for me, I know that this is fibrocartilage or fibrous cartilage. Also in other slides, you'll be able to see fibers within the matrix of the fibrocartilage, which you can kind of see here. So this is also fibrocartilage. Again, you'll have the chondrocytes in rows here, and you can actually see some on the sides as well. And then you'll see the thin fibers within the matrix. So this is fibrocartilage. Again, you'll see the osteocytes sitting in their lacunae. This is the third type of cartilage. This is elastic cartilage. We have large chondrocytes sitting in large lacunae, and then between the chondrocytes and their lacunae, we can see these dark staining fibers, elastic fibers within the elastic cartilage. Make sure you know where we can find elastic cartilage, such as the pinna of the ear, as well as the epiglottis. So more fibrocartilage, with those lovely fibers between the chondrocytes. Osseous tissue or bone tissue. Some structures that you need to be able to identify include the lacunae, osteocytes, the canaliculi, as well as the central canal. So here we can see some osteons. Here's the central canal. We can see the concentric lamellae surrounding the central canal of the osteon. And then within the concentric lamellae, we'll see the darker staining cells. These are the osteocytes sitting in their lacunae. You can't really see the lacunae too much in this type of objective, but we know that these kind of spider or ant-like cells, those are the osteocytes. So here we see the osteocytes. These little kind of leggy things, these are the canaliculi between the osteocytes. They kind of allow for communication between osteocytes. So this whole structure is the osteon, and then in the middle would be the central canal. And just another osteon. So that's it for osseous or bone tissue. So these are the histoslides for nervous tissue and blood. Some structures you guys need to make sure you're studying include the parts of the multipolar neuron, the dendrites, as well as the axon and the cell body and the nucleolus. You'll see a transverse section of the spinal cord. Make sure you know which ones are the dorsal horns versus the ventral horns, which one's gray matter, which one's gray matter versus white matter. And then we'll see axons with myelin sheaths, as well as the nodes of Ronbe. So we'll see a longitudinal section of an axon with that myelin sheath covering. And then make sure you know the different coverings of the peripheral nerve, the whole peripheral nerve, and then within the peripheral nerve, the nerve fascicles on different layers. So here we see many multipolar neurons. We call them multipolar because it has many dendrites in one axon. So we can see the cell body here with the nucleus and the nucleolus. And then we can see the different processes, dendrites, and then one long axon. So here we see a beautiful multipolar neuron with its cell body and then the different cell processes, like the dendrites, and one of them will be a long axon. Another example of a multipolar neuron with its many parts and the processes. Again, another multipolar neuron. Here's a cross-section of the spinal cord. So we have the centralized gray matter and then the outer white matter, and when we have the different horns. So this would be considered the dorsal horns located dorsally of the spinal cord, and then these would be the ventral horns. I know that because we have a big dorsal ganglia here, so this would be dorsal, and then down here would be ventral. So this is gray matter. Within the ventral horns, this is where you'll find your multipolar neurons. Within the white matter, these contain the axons of the neurons. Within the gray matter, we have dorsal horns, we have the ventral horns, and then we have this commissure. This is the gray commissure, and there should be a hole within the commissure called the central canal. Again, the central canal important for the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. A lighter section of the spinal cord. Again, we have our dorsal horns, which are a little bit thinner compared to the thicker ventral horns. We'll have the gray commissure, and then this hole being the central canal. So this centralized part is gray matter that contain neuronal cell bodies, and then the outer white matter that has the axons of the neurons that can either ascend or descend the spinal cord. So here is peripheral nerve tissue. We see a nice longitudinal section covering the teased nerve, and then we have sort of this gap right here. This is called the node of Ranvier. So we have the myelin sheath of the axon, and then here this little gap would be that node of Ranvier. Again, some more axons with their myelin sheaths, and then some nodes of Ranvier here. See multiple nodes of Ranvier. And here, this shows you the peripheral nerve and its different coverings. So make sure you're comfortable identifying the different coverings. So the outer, of course, being the epineurium. Then you have the nerve fascicles, and they're surrounded by perineurium, and then you have the individual axons that make up the nerve fascicles, and those are surrounded by endoneurium. So outer epineurium, middle perineurium, and then inner endoneurium. So then we'll get into the different blood cells that we will find in blood smears. Of course, you have your red blood cells, also known as your erythrocytes, and then you have your leukocytes and the different types of leukocytes. You will have the granular cells, which are the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils. Those have granules in their cytoplasm, and then you have your agranulocytes, which are the lymphocytes and your monocytes that do not have granules in the cytoplasm. So here we see the red pale cells. Those are the red blood cells. And then we can see a bunch of different white blood cells. So this one that has the many multi-lobed nucleus, this is a neutrophil. For me, because it does have a large nucleus and a large amount of cytoplasm, this would be a monocyte. These two would probably be monocytes as well. This, with this little rim of cytoplasm and a large nucleus, this would be a lymphocyte. And again, you have all these red blood cells. And then these little dots or specks, those are actually platelets or thrombocytes. So here we see a larger version of the neutrophil, the multi-lobe nucleus making up the neutrophil. Again, this is a large cell with a kidney bean-shaped nucleus, lots of cytoplasm. This is a monocyte. Then you'll have your red blood cells, and then these little specks are your platelets or thrombocytes. Another really great picture of a monocyte. So again, you have that kidney bean-shaped nucleus with lots of cytoplasm, and it's a large cell. This is a monocyte. And then here it kind of looks like a fried egg with a large yolk-like nucleus and a very small rim of cytoplasm. This is a lymphocyte. Now, mind you, we have three kinds of lymphocytes. We have B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and natural killer cells. You cannot tell based on this picture which of the three lymphocytes this would be. So we just label it as a lymphocyte. So also on the slide, we'll see more platelets and these pale red cells. Those are the erythrocytes or red blood cells. Next slide. So this blood smear, we can see more red blood cells, multi-loop nuclei of the neutrophils. Here's a neutrophil, there's a neutrophil. Again, neutrophils being the most numerous of the white blood cells. Never let monkeys eat bananas. Here's a large neutrophil, just a close-up of a neutrophil with a multi-loop nucleus. Kind of look like weird sausages. And then you have your red blood cells. More neutrophils, red blood cells. This might be a lymphocyte. Here again, we see a monocyte and a lymphocyte. Ooh, so here we see the red staining granules within the cytoplasm, bilobe nucleus. This is an eosinophil. So we see eosinophils on this slide, as well as red blood cells and some platelets or thrombocytes. Here we have the chocolate chip cookie cell with the dark staining granules in the cytoplasm. This is the basophil. And then we can see some monocytes. Here are these larger cells and the red blood cells. All right, so those are some of the slides that you might be seeing on the practical exam. Good luck studying.